Hugh Despenser the Younger, known as such to distinguish him from his father Hugh Despenser the Elder, rose not by sword or legacy, but through proximity to the crown. Born around 1286 into a noble family of middling prominence, Hugh's fortunes changed dramatically when he married Eleanor de Clare, granddaughter of King Edward I, and niece to the reigning monarch Edward II. That marriage was no mere union of households. It brought Despenser dangerously close to the heart of English power. By 1318, he had become the royal chamberlain, a position that allowed him daily access to Edward II. Soon his influence grew unchecked. Those around the king began to notice his grip tightening, not only over Edward himself, but over land, wealth, and policy. Despenser exploited his position to accumulate vast estates, particularly in South Wales, seizing properties and titles at the expense of other nobles. In an era where feudal loyalty was currency, this aggressive expansion made him bitter enemies. Known as greedy and unscrupulous, Despenser was accused by chroniclers of manipulating legal proceedings and exploiting his role to enrich himself. The Vita Edwardi Secundi, a near-contemporary source, notes how all men turned their hearts against him because of his pride and wrongdoing. It wasn't just jealousy, it was fear. Nobles who had once stood equal to the king now found themselves stripped of lands, tried without fairness, and silenced through Despenser's reach. Edward II, perhaps too weak or too enthralled, refused to curb Despenser's ambitions. The king's dependence on him bordered on obsession. Parliament grew resentful. The barons, once tolerant of royal favoritism, viewed Despenser as a threat not only to their power, but to the kingdom itself. By 1321, tensions had reached a breaking point. A coalition of barons forced the king to exile Despenser and his father. But exile was short-lived. The following year, Edward recalled them, launching a brutal campaign of retribution against their enemies. Despenser returned more powerful than before, now not just the king's favorite, but his instrument of vengeance. In those years, England was not ruled from the throne, but from Despenser's whisper. And when the whisper becomes a roar, history shows that power like his never dies quietly. Betrayal and Downfall, Despenser's fatal missteps. By 1322, Hugh Despenser the Younger had become, in all but name, the most powerful man in England. Through Edward II's favor, he controlled lands, titles, and the machinery of royal justice. But with every manor seized, with every enemy imprisoned or executed, Despenser made another implacable foe. His greatest error was not ambition. It was the belief that power could shield him from consequence. England groaned under his rule. Nobles and knights who once held royal favor found themselves ruined by fabricated charges or manipulated courts. Despenser used his authority to confiscate properties and redistribute them to loyalists, or more often to himself. In South Wales, he exercised semi-autonomous power, enforcing harsh rule over the local marcher lords. The chronicler Jean Lebel later described him as a man who acted as if he were king, but Despenser's unchecked dominance created an unlikely alliance. Queen Isabella of France, Edward II's estranged wife, and Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord who had once been imprisoned by Despenser's hand. In 1325, Isabella traveled to France under the guise of diplomatic duty, but in reality, she was laying the groundwork for rebellion. She refused to return until Despenser was removed from power, a demand Edward refused. That refusal marked the beginning of the end. By September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small army. They were welcomed not with resistance, but with open gates. The nobility, clergy, and even commoners had suffered too long under Despenser's regime. Entire towns rose in support of the Queen. As the rebellion spread like fire through dry fields, Edward and Despenser fled westward, desperately trying to reach loyal territory in Wales, but there was no loyal ground left. On November 16, 1326, near Lantrisant, Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured along with the fugitive king. The man who had ruled through fear and favor now stood alone, without protector or ally. The Queen and her allies knew that as long as Despenser lived, Edward's influence might be restored. And more than that, they knew the people demanded justice. Not a quiet exile, but a reckoning. A formal trial followed, but the verdict was predetermined. Despenser was accused of treason, theft, and tyranny. But it was not the crimes themselves that doomed him. It was the symbolic need to erase his power so completely that it could never return. Thus, the man who had dominated England through calculated manipulation would be destroyed just as deliberately, not only to punish him, but to send a message. His downfall would not be quiet nor clean. It would be designed to erase his legacy, to humiliate his memory, and to reassert royal authority. The execution, a scene of medieval horror. It was November 24, 1326, in the market town of Hereford. A hastily erected scaffold loomed above the crowd, and at its center stood a man whose name had become synonymous with tyranny, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Captured alongside the deposed Edward II just days before, Despenser now faced the judgment of Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, but more significantly, he faced the fury of a realm long poisoned by his greed and cruelty. His sentence was not merely death. It was to be a spectacle, an execution designed with deliberate precision to humiliate and erase not only the man, but the legacy he had tried to carve through fear. Despenser was charged with high treason, theft, extortion, and bringing ruin to the realm, yet the punishment he received far exceeded mere legal reckoning. It was political theatre, sharpened to the edge of vengeance. He was stripped of his garments and mocked with a crown of nettles to symbolize his influence over Edward. Then, before a jeering crowd, he was dragged through the streets on a hide-covered hurdle, a punishment reserved for the highest traitors of the crown. Chroniclers such as Geoffrey Le Baker later recorded the proceedings, noting that Despenser was despised by all men, and the manner of his end rejoiced many. The method of execution was among the harshest known to English law: hanging, drawing, and quartering. He was first hanged, suspended by the neck, but cut down before death could take him. Still conscious, he was tied to a ladder, where, according to historical accounts, he was subjected to a form of internal punishment. His body was symbolically desecrated in front of the crowd, an act meant to purify and condemn. Only then was his heart removed and cast into the fire. Finally, his body was beheaded and divided. The parts were distributed to various cities across England. His head was displayed on London Bridge, while his limbs were sent to York, Bristol, Dover, and Newcastle. This was no ordinary execution. It was a calculated dismantling of a man once feared and despised, now reduced to a warning. The message was clear: no subject, no matter how close to the king, could rule in place of the crown. Power abused without restraint would not be quietly buried. It would be broken apart in full view. Edward II, imprisoned and helpless, could only witness the fate of the man he had once trusted more than any other. Despenser's death marked the symbolic end of Edward's reign. Within a year, the king himself would be forced to abdicate, and would later die in captivity under mysterious and still debated circumstances. The execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger remains one of the most chilling punishments ever carried out under English law, not for its method alone, but for what it represented. It was not the death of a man. It was the public dismantling of tyranny. What does Despenser's fate reveal about the dangers of absolute power and the cycles of vengeance that shape history? Comment below with your thoughts. As the Vita, Edwardi Secunda records, Despenser perished deservedly, for he had been a destroyer of the realm.